Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I want to telescope out about our field and simplify it. It will be an oversimplification, but I want to simplify the types of intervention and the types of work that we do. Why do I find this to be important? Because we've overcomplicated the field. We have created acronyms and endless theoretical orientations and all sorts of stuff. And frankly, I cannot imagine being a student coming into this and a new professional and finding any semblance of organization around this. And I know there are people out there who have kind of talked about this, but I want to personally insert myself into this conversation and say, hey, here's how I organize and think about treatment. And hopefully this will be helpful for you, whether you're a seasoned provider or you are a new provider to the field. So let's start with what is intervention? What if we had to organize types of intervention, what fundamentally are we doing? Well, possibly egotistically, I point to I don't think it's egotistic. I believe in my theory, my theory of change over time, this sort of ground, observe, act. Benefits from this sort of dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. There's gray, there's transitions between them. But if I had to distill fundamentally what we're doing, there is more kind of like experiential process and kind of holding work on one end of the fence. And then there is more kind of directive, action-oriented work on the other end of the fence. And theoretical orientations and types of interventions are usually represented by both to a certain degree. I'll give two examples. Me, of course, relational psychodynamic, as you might guess, especially because I'm psychodynamic, is I'm a little bit more on the processy side. I tend to kind of hold and explore and be curious and I'm very observational. And so my expertise, the area I probably do best in, is the observational phase and in to a certain degree the grounding phase of there's aspect of reparenting, there's a relational closeness, there's a positive emotional relational experience with me, and so I'm very much tending to that end of the fence. I do believe that's a lot of what I'm doing. However, people sometimes project onto us that we're not a present focused orientation, that psychodynamic is doesn't care about the present. Au contraire, we just love exploring the greater context and people's identities so that we can be more intentional with action. Now, I'll readily admit, if you want to compare me to someone who's in a much more action-oriented phase and really can hit action with lots of activities and worksheets and and methods of practice, they'll blow me out of the water. I can absolutely do it. I think I do a good job, but it's just not where generally speaking, my orientation and my tendencies live. I get people there, and it's part and parcel to my approach, but it's not I would argue like the real meat of it. The meat of it is a little bit earlier, and I think that's not just important for my choice in kind of appreciating my theoretical orientation. It also helps me organize around where am I at with people. It goes back to the stages of change for my version of change over time. Grounding, observing, and acting, and how I move through those, and how can I meet those needs, and how can a client identify this for themselves. Let's give example number 2. It's another favorite of mine, though. So, acceptance and commitment therapy. It's a third wave CBT. CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. And to me, it is more often wielded as an action-oriented directive. It's like, hey, what are your values? How do you, defuse from the past so you're living mindfully and intentionally in the present and moving towards your values? And so it's got very much an action-oriented vibe, which you will typically get more of in cognitive behavioral CBT-esque type interventions. Now, any CBT intervention, ACT included, is not without context and processing and grounding. I mean, they talk a lot about that. They will readily pause and help with grounding skills and stress management in the service of doing action. They will talk about schemas and things that people hold inside of themselves that influence and shape action. But there's a gravitational pull towards action and direction compared to, like I just said, the psychodynamic side, where there's a gravitational pull towards grounding, but especially observation. And that needs to be something that they're aware of and that they own. And that in doing so, I have to be more intentional about how I engage in action. And my hope would be is if someone's ascribing to ACT or if someone's ascribing to a more general CBT, they need to be extra aware of when they need to pause and move more into a process observational stance to ensure that the action truly is intentional, that they're not leaving behind something that needs to be grounded and observed further, more richly, before someone goes into action. So to me, there's a universality to this. When I encounter younger clinicians, newer providers to the field, it's just like, well, where do you lean? There's no right or wrong here. Like, knowing your personality and knowing kind of what you are pulled to. Are you a little bit more processy? Or are you a little bit more directive? And know that about yourself. And then critically evaluate your chosen theoretical orientation or orientations and look for opportunities for growth, because we need to have a repertoire that includes all of them. If you were to ascribe to my ground, observe, act model, which, again, full disclosure, it's not like I'm, brilliantly conjuring this out of thin air. There's aspects of psychodynamic and trauma theory that have already spoken about these things. But if you were to describe a belief in that, we need to be well-rounded enough, but we also need to know that we cannot be an expert in everything. And that's okay. It also, I think, helps people hopefully feel safer in integrative models. Like, if the models we create tend to land more firmly in one than the other, it would make sense to borrow from others. So, like, using me as an example, the two examples I used are the ones that I use the most. I'm relational psychodynamic first and foremost. It is what I do most of the time. But you better believe when I'm going into more action-oriented phases of treatment, I borrow heavily from ACT because it jives with me. It's something that kind of augments the relational psychodynamic perspective, and I will merrily, happily pull from it in a way that I hope is useful to folks that come and see me. So I don't know how much, I imagine and I hope, this is not kind of totally new and novel. And again, my hope is that if you're earlier in the career, you've at least had some education or, professors or peers that kind of talk about this. But in case it's helpful to think more macro, that we tend to lean on these kind of two holistically, these two kind of poles, the more processy versus the more action-oriented ones, the ones that are a little bit more holding, grounding, exploratory versus the ones that are more directive and movement focused. But at the end of the day, we probably, it behooves us to represent all of them the best that we can. And then when we're not a good fit, or we just don't have expertise based on where, if a client comes in, they really want to be around action, I might refer them out, and that's okay. Which I'll end with this. If you're a consumer listening to this, I hope it's helpful to kind of organize around, generally speaking, I might encounter providers who are a little bit more processy and a little bit less directive overall. And then I will encounter those that are a little bit more directive and action-oriented. And what might my preference be? Is this something that I could vet or kind of inquire with my provider about, just to feel them out and what I think I might need? Understanding, though, sometimes, we get people who are very action-oriented, and us providers go, maybe we need to slow down, and vice versa. I really want to slow down. I really want to, you've been slowing down for a while. Maybe it's an action time. But again, you do the best you can. It's all about match. Just, us inhabiting ourselves as providers, and you finding a provider that you like and does good work with you. So again, for whatever that's worth, I hope it's helpful, and hopefully something to our field embraces a little bit better, rather than just shoving ourselves into these theoretical orientation and intervention boxes. I don't find it to be terribly helpful for my own health, never mind the health and benefit of those who come to see us. So thanks so much for listening and watching, and as always, stay curious.